Senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. President. Over the last few weeks, many of my colleagues have been engaged in a very serious, very deliberate, very thoughtful attempt to deal with the issue of student loan interest rates, which doubled July 1st. They have contributed significantly in terms of trying to move this issue forward and reach a thoughtful and appropriate conclusion. From what I have heard, the approach of the Bipartisan Student Loan Certainty Act of 2013, I don't think, despite those good efforts and good intentions, they've reached the objective, which is to make college affordable for all of our students, to somehow try to prevent this tidal wave of student financial debt, which is, in some cases, overwhelming so many students and families across the country. Instead of emphasizing the students, I think what they've done is just try to shield the government from investing in those students. The clear impact of the legislation that is being proposed is that it will increase the cost for education for students. Now, we were in a position where we reduced legislative the rate to 3.4%. We had an extension for 1 year to this July. It doubles to the previous existing law to 6.8%. What this proposal does is they are able to keep the rate relatively low, although it goes up a bit higher than the 3.4%, but invariably, just mathematically, it gets very high. Now, we have placed some caps there, and that's something I salute the authors for their efforts to put caps on the different programs, but those caps are very high also. The inevitability is that the one sure thing is that over the course of the next few years, students would pay more for higher education at a time when they can afford it less and less, and at a time when we need more fully qualified graduates to take the jobs of this new century to be competitive internationally. So we have before us, I think, despite all these great efforts, legislation that will shift more and more costs to students. Instead of preventing the doubling of these rates to 6.8%, it would gradually raise these rates above 6.8%. We might see 1 or 2 or 3 years of rates that are relatively below that number, but inevitably, mathematically, those rates will go beyond 6.8%. And the caps are rather high. And what we'll see is that a generation of students, particularly in my sense, and the numbers seem to bear that out, the high school students of today will be paying a lot more for their student loans, and their families will be paying a lot more. And it will add to the debt of these students and their families. And it will restrict their ability to become the kind of not only qualified workers in our economy, but also the people that drive the economy. Young people who buy homes, who buy automobiles, who are able, because of their skills, to earn enough to contribute not just the productivity of the country, but their own ability to purchase and keep that engine of the economy moving forward. And there's no real guess as to what level it could go up, because now we're moving away from a fixed rate and moving to an adjustable rate loan. And the rates have been pegged to the 10-year Treasury bill, a rate that we know is going up. It's gone up nearly 1% since just May. And in this environment, it is likely to continue to go up. And the rates that students will pay could rise much more quickly than the projections even that CBO is suggesting. It could rise because of Federal Reserve policy. If they decide to unwind quantitative easing and in such a way that rates shoot up, then those rates could just spike very dramatically. Now, students and advocates have raised their voices loud and clear, urging us not to take this kind of action. They've said, no deal is better than a bad deal. So the people we are trying to help are actually saying, no, that's not the kind of help we need. So I, with deep regret, believe that this is not the right approach going forward. What the students and advocates have asked us to do is to say, keep it at 3.4%. I propose legislation to do that for a year, so that we could work on some of the fundamental issues that are driving costs, such as the incentives and disincentives in colleges for tuition, the issue of, which is separate but very important, well, how do we not only provide reasonable interest rates, but how do we refinance all those students that are overwhelmed by debt? How do they get advantage of historically low rates today? All those difficult issues are being put off. I think they should be engaged, and I think we needed the time to engage on those issues. Unlike the approach of at least another year of 3.4%, the proposal before us would lock in about $184 billion in student loan revenue. That is in the current CBO baseline. And then there's an additional $715 million, which this proposal would generate. All that is coming out of the pockets of students and families. Now, paying for college is tough. And this legislation, I think, unfortunately, could make it tougher, because it would put in a permanent structure for setting student loan interest rates that could quickly result in students and parents paying more for student loans. This is not a temporary fix to get us to a better place in terms of incentives for tuition, in terms of refinancing, in terms of letting students more actively and more affordably pursue college education. This is a long-term fix. And it's just simple math. In a zero-budget environment, and that's one of the principles that is incorporated in this legislation, reducing what students pay today means that students have to pay more tomorrow. If we're assuming a 6.8% fixed rate over 10 years, and we lower that rate, as this legislation does, then just do the math. It's going to have to be higher to keep it zero neutral with respect to the budget. And that's what's going to happen. So we're going to have some relief today, but it'll be followed inevitably by students who will pay more and individually have a much larger burden to bear. So we are in a position, I think, of taking steps that's going to make college more expensive, simply, at a time when we have to make it more affordable, not only for individual families and students, but for the future and success of our economy. Now, we are also departing from our past experience with market-based interest rates in the federal student loan programs. This proposal also locks in historically high surcharges on top of basing the loans on a higher cost instrument. Previously, we were using the 91-day T-bill, which, because it was a short-term note, the interest rates were lower relative to the 10-year note. Well, now we're using a much higher baseline, and then we're adding historically higher premium to that baseline. So the legislation builds in additional costs that we haven't used, even when we had rates that were moved based on market conditions. Under the market-based rates that were in effect between 1998 and 2006, students benefited from historically low interest rates. These rates were indexed, as I said, at the lower 91-day Treasury bill rate rather than the 10-year Treasury bill rate. And as I mentioned before, we already know this 10-year Treasury bill rate is moving up. We are making these changes from the perspective of interest rates at exactly the wrong time, at the bottom of the interest rate curve, as it starts its climb up. That argues to me, and frankly, I think most people, if they were going to make a choice on a loan today, would try to pick a fixed rate, even if it was a little higher than the introductory rate on a variable loan, because of the experience of the last several years and because of what they're seeing all around them, rising interest rates over time. This year, borrowers who are repaying these loans, I'm talking about the loans that were made in that period of time from 1998 to 2006, have an interest rate of 2.35%. And over the last 5 years, their rate averaged 2.41%. They benefited from the declining rates. They benefited from the huge expansion of Federal Reserve quantitative easing. They benefited from an economy who slowed down, ironically, so that interest rates were falling. Now we're on the other side of that curve. And students won't benefit from the rates, the market rates. They will actually see higher rates as we go forward. And you know, we offered these rates in the context of the old program where we had to also subsidize banks. So today, I would think with the banks out of the picture, with the government through direct lending doing the lending, we should be able to find a solution that we can actually lock in much lower rates for students. And that's the kind of solution that will take time. The time, I believe, that we could have spent and should spend by extending the 3.4% rate another year and looking creatively and thoughtfully about a whole spectrum of issues, but with the goal of trying to give students and families the assurances that they can afford college, and that also college will be affordable in the sense that the cost of college will start coming under some type of control. That takes a lot of work, and we're not doing that work today. We are adopting a rate structure permanently that, because of where we are in the economy, will invariably mean that students will pay more and more each year. So, as mentioned before, because of the great effort of some of my colleagues, Senator Manchin, Senator King, Senator Alexander, Senator Burr, Senator Durbin, I could go on and on, there have been some improvements made in the initial version of this legislation, particularly caps on individual loan programs. But those caps are very high. Under the new proposal, the cap for the subsidized loans are 8.25%, and then there are caps that go all the way up to 10.5%. Again, let's step back here. You know, we're putting a cap at those levels because there's a reasonable expectation that we'll reach those levels. And as a result, we're going from the current law, which is 6.8%, to as high as, in some cases, for parent loans, 10.5%. That's a huge swing, not in favor of students, but to their disadvantage. That's why I'm working on an amendment which I hope to offer that would put the cap at 6.8% for all Stafford loans and 7.9% for the parent plus loans. Again, if we're looking at a fixed rate of 6.8% and we can't do better than that 2, 3, 4, and 5 years from now, we have to ask ourselves, do we really need to make these changes? Or should we make these changes? Now, if we adopt an amendment as I propose, at least we're telling parents they won't be worse off than current law. And they'll be better off because of interest rates at the moment in the next several years. And I hope we could do that. We are looking at federal student loan debt that is over $1 trillion. This can only mathematically increase that debt. We should be investing in our students, giving them the benefit of relatively low-cost loans so they can go to school and get on with their lives and get our economy moving forward again. And this is also an issue that goes to one of the core issues that we face as a country. Indeed, it's a core issue across the globe. The growing inequality of income and, in a sense, opportunity in our country and in countries across the globe. Now, here in the United States, the great engine for opportunity has always been education. And if we make it more expensive, then fewer people can take advantage of it. And if fewer people can take advantage of it, the inequality will grow because they won't have the chance for the good-paying jobs. And oh, by the way, in a competitive global economy, we could see our position slip because we don't have these talented people. So this is an issue that strikes not just the sort of technical aspects of a program. This, in my view, goes to the heart of what it is that gives opportunity to America. And I believe it's education. And I believe if we make it expensive, then less opportunity will be available. I believe if we make it expensive, we'll be less productive and less competitive. I believe that despite all the efforts of extraordinarily talented and dedicated colleagues, we can do better and we should do better. And Mr. President, as such, I would reluctantly oppose the underlying legislation. I at least hope we could cap it if the amendment I offer would be accepted. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.